In earlier modules, I mentioned that Web Forms includes controls to replace common HTML elements, such as form fields. In this lesson, let's review these components in a little more detail. Up until now, I have referred to Web Forms server controls in somewhat generic terms, but in reality, there are four main types of these controls. If you read Microsoft's documentation, you'll find these elements broken into HTML controls, web controls, validation controls, and user controls. Let's define each of these in a little more detail. HTML server controls are basically HTML elements that have an additional attribute added to them called runAt, which is set to a value of server. The Web Forms framework identifies elements with this tags as server friendly and integrates them into its processing pipeline. You can also add an ID attribute that allows you to access them from the code behind file of your page. HTML controls are the most lightweight, and they can sometimes give you nice control over your markup since you're using fairly standard HTML elements. Web server controls are one step above HTML controls in terms of abstraction. These items sometimes map closely to HTML elements, but they can also represent larger HTML concepts such as nav bars and sitemaps. Web controls are more closely integrated into the Web Forms framework than standard HTML controls, so they do provide some additional features, but the differences are a bit beyond the scope of this course. Validation controls are another type of server tag offered by Web Forms. Essentially, these controls exist to validate the data of other controls. For example, there is a validation control called required, which allows you to associate it with a web control and ensure the item has an acceptable value. There are other types of validation as well, such as range and regular expression validators. User controls are another type of server-side control that's offered by Web Forms. As the name implies, these are reusable elements that you create yourself. They can be embedded on web page for various functions, such as creating widgets or certain types of navigation and those types of features. The source code for them is placed in a separate file and can have its own code behind file as well for more server-side logic. We'll discuss these controls more in a later module. One of the main reasons Web Forms provides server-side versions of HTML elements is so that they can be directly accessed and manipulated by server-side logic, much like JavaScript can access elements on the client side. These controls allow C# logic in your code behind files to directly read and write properties of these elements, such as to retrieve or set form values. This also helps with the code separation efforts of Web Forms, since it reduces the amount of logic in your markup file. If we revisit our legacy app for a moment, it's really easy to see these types of controls in action. In our project, I have chosen to use web server controls instead of HTML controls. This ensures we get the most complete feature set offered by Web Forms with minimal drawbacks, and it's what I usually see in real-world projects as well. At the top of our Create Task form, we have some simple text box controls. These will generate text input boxes for the user. As you can see, the simpler web control tags are fairly simple to work with. The ID property is the name we use to access this control from the code behind file. The runAt attribute just declares this as a server-side component, which means it will be part of view state and accessible from the code behind, and so on. CSS class is a replacement for the traditional HTML class attribute. You'll find that web server controls have replacements for most of those standard HTML attributes. If we just jump over to the code behind for a moment, we can kind of scan through this logic and see how it's directly accessing these elements and assigning or retrieving their values. This would obviously not be possible unless Web Forms provided a server-side equivalent for these front-end HTML tags. The controls also integrate well with the various stages of the page lifecycle, which we can also work with through this code behind. Back in our ASPX page, you can see a few other examples of HTML replacements, such as drop-down lists and checkboxes. There are also quite a few validation attributes in here, but we'll be looking at those more in the validation module later on. One last thing I'll mention is that if we expand this menu item over on the left called Toolbox, we can see a list of all of the various controls available to us. Many of the controls under the standard category correspond more one-to-one with HTML elements, but if you click through other categories, you'll find more interesting options such as menus and sitemaps. Reviewing what every single control does would take quite a bit of time. In this module, we're just focused on how common web forms controls and features translate over to MVC, so let's move on to discussing how we build these types of HTML elements in MVC.